Kate, is this on? Yeah, it is. I know people are still going in, but it's 9:35, so we're 1 minute past due. So let us begin. I am delighted to introduce our speaker this morning and for next week as well, to continue our 5th and 6th session in our New Testament series, Dr. Christy Cobb. It's been great, no pressure. It will continue to be great, I know. Christy Cobb is the Assistant Professor of Christianity at University of Denver. This is your first year there, so welcome to Denver. She is the author of Slavery, Gender, Truth, and Power in Luke Acts, and other ancient narratives. So we're really excited. We've just finished the Gospels, and so we're excited to have this different perspective on Luke, and then again next week on the Acts of the Apostles. Dr. Cobb is also on the editorial board of the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion. Recently, she co-edited a volume entitled Sex, Violence, and Early Christian Texts. Her research interests include slavery, gender, sexuality, and families in early Christianity, ancient fiction, the Gospels, and the Acts of the Apostles. We are delighted to have you at Montview Church, and we hope this will begin a long relationship to have you here and teaching this wonderful crowd of people. So would you join me in welcoming Dr. Christy Cobb?
Thank you so much for having me this morning, and I hope next week as well as we explore slavery and gender in Luke and Acts. So first, my plan for the class. So I'm going to sort of give us some situational information about the history of slavery in the Greco-Roman world, which will also lead to the background of slavery in the New Testament. My focus for today and for next week is 3 characters in Luke and Acts that are enslaved women. And so I'm going to be reading the text through their perspectives. And I also have a method of interpretation, which I'll be using and I'll tell you a bit more about, but which is basically feminist. And I'm arguing that these 3 enslaved women are truth tellers, that they're used within Luke and Acts to vocalize truth. So today, though, I'll give you some background information and I'll focus specifically on the enslaved woman in Luke 22. And then I'm also going to give a little bit of contemporary connections. Why does this matter, this kind of interpretation for us in our current context? And then next week, I'll do enslaved women in Acts, which there are 2 really fascinating characters in Acts of the Apostles. Okay, so slavery in the Greco-Roman world. So first of all, we have quite a lot of people who were enslaved across the Roman Empire. So 10 to 20% of the Roman Empire was enslaved. It depends on the area that you're in, that number. So in rural areas, it might be a little less than 10%, like maybe 8 or 5%. In the cities, it would be higher, right? It would be more like maybe even 30%. Some people say 30% would have been enslaved in Rome itself. So a large part of the population were enslaved persons, enslaved workers. If we start including previously enslaved persons, our number goes even higher than that. Slavery was a foundational aspect of the society. The Roman Empire was a slave society. It was built upon slavery, and really every aspect of society was involved in slavery or used enslaved persons to contribute to work. This included in the household. If a Roman family had enough money to have even one enslaved person in their house, then that gives them the ability to, have someone help with meals, have someone help with cleaning, have someone help with groceries, with childcare, all of those aspects. But a larger, more elite family might have hundreds of enslaved persons working in whatever field that they might be in. So it was really pretty much everywhere, pervasive in the Greco-Roman world. And I'll also just add that does include our Jewish context as well. Pretty much the aspects of slavery that we see in the Greco-Roman world is very similar to Jewish community in the 1st century, which would have been when the Jesus movement was developing. Again, certain aspects, rural Judea would have less enslaved persons than, say, Jerusalem, but we do have pretty much a very similar matching of aspects of slavery in Judaism as well as the Greco-Roman world. So something really important to note about slavery when we're talking about antiquity versus our own context is that slavery was not race-based in antiquity. So what this means is that a person of sort of any ethnicity could be enslaved, and it was not that it was, like in the history of America, it was not based on the color of your skin in antiquity. And that's a really big difference, I think, to note, because so much of what we talk about slavery in America was based on biblical assumptions about slavery. There are a lot of connections between slavery in America and slavery in the Greek and Roman world, but this one aspect is quite different, right? And gives us a very different portrayal or understanding of slavery. So the idea that any person could be enslaved at any point, it was commonly held in antiquity if you fell into the wrong circumstance. There was a fear about this in the first century. So a couple of ways just to give you some background of the ways that people were enslaved. The most common reason was that they were born to someone who was enslaved. So being born into slavery was the most common way that we developed, they developed enslaved persons. And so, and this was also the best way, because then the family didn't have to pay for it. And so enslaved women were often used in this way to create more enslaved persons for the household. But then also being abandoned at birth, and so this is frequently noted in ancient literature that this could happen, that especially if a family is impoverished or didn't have enough money to take care of another child, then they might leave the child somewhere, and then that child would be raised as a slave. And so that also happened, not as common as being born into slavery, but it was something that happened occasionally. Another major reason is conquered in war or battle. So Rome is a great example of this. When the Roman Empire would go into a certain area, and if they would try to, engage conquer this small region or area, if they won, and they usually did, right, then they would enslave the persons there if they didn't kill them, right? And so it was, especially women and children were captured and put into slavery in that way. And this could be elite people if that happened as well. Kidnapping, there was a fear of this in antiquity, but it didn't happen, again, as often as some of the other ones that I've mentioned, but it did happen occasionally that someone might be kidnapped and then sold into slavery. And then a final reason, which gets some discussion in some ancient texts as well, is if you have money problems. So if a person in antiquity had money problems, then they might have to sell themselves into slavery in order to cover their debt. That happened occasionally, not maybe as often as we might think. Usually there were other ways of finding money than selling oneself into slavery, but it did happen. And on the other hand, if you were an enslaved person and you had a job in which you could make your own money in some ways and start saving up, you could also buy your way out of slavery in antiquity. This is called manumission. And so we have this idea that enslaved persons could find ways out of slavery through buying their way out or through sometimes an organization, like Christianity and Judaism did do this occasionally in later years, pay the manumission price for someone to be freed from slavery. And then they're a formally enslaved person, not completely free, but at least they had, some freedom in society as a formally enslaved person. And then finally, if an enslaver put it in their will that they might free all the enslaved workers upon their death, then that happened sometimes. So sometimes an enslaver would put that in their will, and the heir might choose to not free those people, and that might happen occasionally, but the law was that if it was in their will, then technically the enslaved persons were supposed to be free. So this gives you a bit of background information, and all of this is relevant to the New Testament because the New Testament was written in a time period when slavery was pervasive, and so all of this was assumed. And so we see this in the New Testament in a variety of ways. So first, slavery is used as a metaphor, which these things you might be familiar with. Paul calls himself a slave to God, right? And when he says that, he means he's under the control of God. And so this idea of slavery informed that metaphor, right? That metaphor was understood by people because slavery was so common. Enslaved characters are referenced in parables. And so Jesus, as you know, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, teaches through parables. And a number of the parables that he gives use enslaved characters throughout. And when he does this, it is metaphorical in some ways. It's also slightly different because these parables give insight into the everyday world of ancient persons. And so when Jesus says things like, when an enslaved person who follows the commands of their enslaver will be blessed, that is revealing to the audience that they would have understood this dynamic, right? Even though it was metaphorical for persons to think about themselves, free persons, in relation to God as their enslaver. But enslaved persons would have probably been in the audience hearing this, and of course, the metaphor only works if you're, relatively aware of how slavery functioned in the first century. Enslaved persons are in the Gospels, are in Acts, and in Paul's letters. They're everywhere. Sometimes our translations don't tell us fully that this person is enslaved. For example, there's two people named in Paul's letter to Romans in Romans 16, Tryphena and Tryphosa, and we believe those two women were enslaved, or at least previously enslaved, if not fully enslaved, because of their names, right? So we can track inscriptions and data and look at the names used for enslaved persons. And so we find enslaved persons everywhere. They are in the book of Acts, in Paul's letters, and in the Gospels. And we have to sort of know and look for them and dig around. They're marginalized characters, but they're present. And Jesus heals enslaved persons. So 2 examples from the Gospel of Luke, 7, 2 through 10 is the slave of the centurion that Jesus healed. And then in 22, which is the chapter we're going to look at, but not particularly this story, is during the arrest of Jesus, and Peter cuts off the ear of an enslaved person that's present. In the Gospel of Luke only, Jesus heals that slave. Whereas in Mark and Matthew, Jesus doesn't heal. So Luke adds this healing to his portrayal of this story. So we have these moments where we know Jesus cared about an enslaved person, healed that enslaved person. Yet also, we have these moments where Jesus himself seems to recognize these ideas and stereotypes about slavery. So Luke 17, 7 through 10, Jesus says, "We are all worthless slaves." And he's talking about in relation to God, but using the term worthless gives a little hint of insight into how enslaved persons were viewed in antiquity. Okay, so the 3 characters that I want to talk about here, there we go, are 3 enslaved women that I'm going to argue, and I hope you'll go with me on this journey, are really vital to the text of Luke and Acts. So they're often overlooked. When we read the gospel, we may not pay attention, we may not realize they're enslaved, but my work and my interpretation of these 3 characters are that they're vital We can't understand Luke's message without these three enslaved women. And then also that they give us insight into the gospel. That if we look at the gospel through their eyes, these marginalized characters, doubly marginalized, women and enslaved, then we get insight into Luke's truth. That's what I will be arguing. So the three are the first questioner of Peter during his denial scene. That's what we'll look at today. As the first person that asked Peter, do you know Jesus, when he denies Jesus? That is an enslaved woman. And we often, again, don't pay attention to her, don't recognize this. But she speaks. She has a line in the gospel. And she has this moment where she's up against Peter in this very important scene. And the second one is Rhoda, who we'll talk about next week, but she answers the door to Peter in Acts 12 when he escapes from prison. So he breaks out of prison in Jerusalem. He comes to find sanctuary in a house church, and the person who opens the door for him is Rhoda, who's an enslaved woman. And then finally, is a prophesying slave girl in Philippi, and she follows Paul and Silas, and she's vocalizing a message in Acts 16. So I'll wait for next week to talk about those final two, but talk about just the Luke 22 enslaved girl today. And the way that I'm connecting these three is through this Greek term called pataske. I put the Greek and the English up. It literally means little girl. And so it is a word that could be used to mean daughter, right? Or could be used to mean child. But in most of our Greek literature, this word ends up being used to mean enslaved person, enslaved woman, and it was most often in domestic contexts. And this is another reason why sometimes when pataske is used in the Bible, people were able to translate it as just girl, and then the reader, if you don't know Greek, is unaware that these are enslaved persons. But the way that pataske was used was demeaning. So it was sort of, and you can think about it in connection to actually slavery in America, when an enslaver might say to a man that's enslaved and call him boy, right? Have you heard that before? I see some heads nodding. So that doesn't mean that man is young. It just means that the person that's enslaving them is trying to infantilize them or demean them. And the same thing happens in the Greek, that men who are enslaved might often be called pais, and women that are enslaved might be called pataske. We don't know the age of these people, but we do know that there were young girls who were enslaved at a very young age. So we could have Rhoda being very young, for example, but we don't know their age. And so because of that, because of pataske, many people have overlooked these characters. But I interpret them all as enslaved, also because of the situations that they're in. Like Rhoda answering the door, and then also this enslaved woman sitting in the courtyard of the high priest, which I'll tell you about in just a minute. Okay, so my strategies for interpretation. So I use a feminist lens, and I'll tell you what that means in just a second. And then I use a bit of literary theory, a guy named Mikhail Bakhtin. I'll talk about that a little today, but more next week, I think. And then finally, I situate this in the broader Greco-Roman world, literarily and archaeologically. And so as you see on the screen, this is a funerary monument. And let's see if I can yeah, there we go. Okay, so I can look with you. This is a deceased woman, and this would have been on her grave. And so what we have is the woman that's larger sitting towards you. She is a free woman, and this is, but she wasn't married, and so she is depicted alone. Maybe she's young. And the figures next to her that are substantially smaller, those are her enslaved attendants. And so artists and sculptors would depict enslaved persons as present here. And so what I do is use this to sort of give us some insight into how people viewed enslaved women in antiquity, this kind of archaeological data, because we don't know much. We don't have enslaved women writing from the 1st century. So we have to use some of this information from the broader world to understand enslaved women. So my feminist interpretation, my reading focuses on marginalized characters. So when I read Luke, I'm not focusing on Jesus or Peter or the disciples. I'm focusing on these minor characters that enter the narrative, and I'm kind of wondering, why are they there? What purpose do they serve? I read with this called a hermeneutic of suspicion, meaning that I'm recognizing these are written in a patriarchal context, and also that most people who translate these are sort of grounded in a patriarchal history of interpretation. And so when I offer my reading, I'm trying to challenge that patriarchal impulse. And then finally, I want to empower these marginalized characters, empower the women, give them voice, give them insight, agency. And for enslaved persons, that's especially important. I mean, it's also important for women, but because enslaved persons weren't given moments to speak or to shine, right? I'm sort of using my methodology to pull them to the surface and give them let them have a voice, let them have agency within the narrative. Even if the author, didn't necessarily intend that, my interpretation can allow that to happen. So Mikhail Bakhtin is a Russian literary theorist and philosopher. This is picture up here. He writes on literary and novelistic elements, and he's often used in biblical criticism, most often in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, because so many of those are narratives. But I think he works quite well with the Gospels and with Acts as well. So I'm going to give you an example of how this works. So this is Luke 1, the prologue. Maybe you went over this when you talked about the Gospels, but Luke 1 gives us some insight into how the author of Luke is writing his Gospel. So he says, "Many others have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who were from the beginning eyewitnesses and servants of the word." And so I pause here to say this. He admits he's not there, he's not an eyewitness, but he knows he gets his information from those who were. And he also admits many have undertaken. So other people have been writing, and he knows he's familiar with what they wrote. And then he says, "I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus." We could have another class on who Theophilus was, but I won't go into that today, "so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed." So Luke tells us this. This is his method for how he writes the gospel. And so Bakhtin might have two things to say about this. One is this term outsidedness. And so Bakhtin writes, "In order to understand, it is immensely important for the person who understands to be located outside the object of his or her creative understanding in time, in space, and in culture." So he believes that truth is often seen from the outside perspective. And I'm going to use this in particular to talk about enslaved women who are on the outside of especially free people. But also when we think about Luke, he has this, this idea that he's an outsider. He's not writing as one of those who is within the disciples of Jesus. He's, absorbing all of the information that other people passed on to him. And therefore, he can give the truth in his gospel. So that idea that is Bakhtinian relates to Luke, I think, quite well. And then finally, Bakhtin has a really interesting idea of truth, which I will say this is one of my favorite quotes by him. I love it. Truth is not born, nor is it to be found inside the head of an individual person. It is born between people collectively searching for truth in the process of their dialogic interaction. So truth is not me sitting at home reading the gospel, right? Truth is us talking, maybe in the Q&A session in a few minutes, right? Truth is found as we dialogue together. And that's the only way truth can be found. We can't find it individually. We have to find it in communication with other people. And so when we look at Bakhtin, I think, can give us these insights into how we see truth. What is truth in the gospel? Okay, so let's see. This is another one of the, this is my archaeological aspect of my method. So this is another funerary monument. And this one, the face has been scratched off by someone, but the enslaved women, I think, are really nicely preserved here. And so one thing I'm going to note about this is that enslaved women were used as objects to enhance the status of the enslaver. So I have another slide where I'll zoom in on these 3 enslaved figures. And so what you can see is the one on the right is holding a jar. And we think this might have held oil in it to make the enslaver more beautiful. The one on the left is holding a mirror. And that also symbolizes the beauty of the enslaver. So these objects that are being carried may not be historical. This may not have been a historical moment, but it gives us insight into the way that these enslaved women were used. The tallest one is holding her hand by her cheek, and this is a stance of grief in antiquity. So this means that the enslaved girl or woman here is sad that her mistress has passed away. And so these 3 are all used to really enhance the view of the deceased, right? They're pictured on there in order to show she's beautiful, in order to show she was kind, she was beloved, even by her slaves, right? And then another thing to show is that look how tiny they are. You see how small they are? So this is called symbolic sizing. And what it means is that the artist or whoever created this gravestone, this ancient gravestone, was depicting the enslaved persons as smaller because they were not as important as the deceased. And so it's an artistic strategy to show to the viewer that they were less important. So it makes them look like they're very young children, but we should not imagine them to be that way. It was a technique used within the art world to show their importance. Okay. Let's get to Luke 22. This is a long scene, so I'll leave it up here for a minute. I have a couple of words underlined. But basically, this is the scene where Jesus has been arrested, right, and is led away. And so they seized him, they led him away, and they brought him into the high priest's house. That will become important in a few minutes. But Peter was following at a distance. So the male disciples are staying a little bit away from Jesus and the crucifixion. Some of the female disciples show up at the cross and at the resurrection. But the male disciples are sort of like worried that they will also be arrested. So he's following at a distance. They make a fire in the middle of the courtyard, and they sit down together, and Peter sat among them. And then a slave girl, so slave girl is my translation, but that is the pataske word that I told you about. A slave girl, seeing him in this firelight, stared at him and said, "This man was also with him." But Peter denied it. "Woman, I do not know him." Then later, someone else, upon seeing him, said, "You are also one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And then about an hour later, yet another kept insisting, "Surely this man was also with him, for he is a Galilean." Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." And this is the moment we might remember the most, at that moment, while he was still speaking, the cock crowed, the rooster crows in the morning, right? The Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the word of the Lord and how he had said to him, before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. This scene, if you go to any commentary, most often they're going to focus on Peter. Right? They're going to focus on Peter and this, idea of how could Peter, one of his closest disciples, deny that he knows Jesus? How could that be? And this moment where Peter and Jesus look at one another, when he turned and looked at Peter, and then Peter weeps bitterly, that gets a lot of attention in scholarship. But what I want to focus on instead is that one slave girl. The one slave girl who often gets overlooked in there. And I'm going to give you a little bit more background as to why I think she's so important. I'm not going to go too heavily into the Greek on a Sunday morning, but three words to give you some aspects of this. So the first one is akolutheo, which is to follow. And that word is when it said Peter followed from a distance. That word often means discipleship. So those people who got up and followed him. Jesus said, come with me, and they followed him. This is the word that's often used there. Pataske I already mentioned, and then the final one, atenezo. So this is look intently or gaze earnestly. This, I think, is really important because the slave girl looks at Peter with this verb. That's how Luke describes it. And when this is used in other places in Luke Acts, then the gaze is directed at someone who's holy or someone who's important, and also it indicates prophetic speech might be coming. So that term is an important one to be used in this very short passage. Okay, so our context for Luke 22 is the larger passion narrative, and our setting is this priest, the house of the high priest, and the courtyard that would have been there in Jerusalem. If we imagine this historically, this would have been a large space. Whoever was the high priest in Jerusalem had money. Right? They had support, they were elite. And so we can imagine that this space might have looked like this. This is a mansion that has been archaeologically excavated in Jerusalem. We don't know that it's the high priest, but it's a major house from the 1st century that has been excavated. And you can see it's really small for you out there, but the courtyard is sort of the back square that's outside, but still sort of inside the space of the house. And a house this big would have required quite a lot of enslaved persons to keep it running. And especially thinking about what the high priest might have done in terms of his responsibilities at the temple or within Judaism, he would have needed enslaved workers all throughout to keep this place going. And so the idea that in Luke 22, we have enslaved persons sitting around the fire with Peter, that should be expected in this context of 1st century when slavery is pervasive, more slaves are in the city, and then, of course, this big house that we imagine in Jerusalem. So the things that I want to bring up about this, my analysis of this very short passage is first the gaze of the slave girl and how important that is, that she looked at Peter and she saw him. Prophetically saw him, knew that he was one of Jesus' followers. The use of light and dark here in Luke Acts, and then the statement made by the slave girl and the statements made by other questioners. Those are my sort of 4 aspects of interpretation here. So the gaze. So she gazed intently at him. As I mentioned before, the Greek here indicates prophetic gaze, or that she might have insight that she might be speaking prophetically. She's looking right at Peter. And then finally, this text is also in Mark, and Luke changes the verb to atenezo, to this prophetic gaze. So I think that, one revision of Mark's version of the story can indicate that she's going to be important to Luke and sort of supports my interpretation. The light of the slave girl. So she is sitting near the fire. She's sitting near the light. And light and dark is used very symbolically within Luke Acts. We might say the whole of the New Testament, light and dark is used symbolically. And so here, because she's identified as by the light, then that also indicates she's going to be important. So first, the verb used to say that she's gazing at someone, who's important, and then that she's sitting by the light. And then finally, her statement. Oops, let me see. There we go. All right, she says, this one was also with him. So I make a lot about this use of with him, meaning with Jesus. And what I suggest is that she's vocalizing Lucan theology that is, basically she's saying a disciple is someone who is with Jesus, right? That's who becomes a disciple. And so Jesus was with him. That opens up this idea of who can be a disciple even beyond the 12. We have the 12, but if someone is with him, that can include other devoted followers as well. And so her statement portrays Lucan theology in this very clear way that also speaks to discipleship. Okay, and then the statements made by others. So another part of my argument is that she speaks and she's dismissed by the reader, by Peter. Then the second speaker speaks, and I suggest this is also a male slave because the text says a similar one in the Greek. And so another one speaks, meaning another slave, but male pronouns are used there. And he says, you are also one of them. And Peter says, man, I am not. So again, the lowest of the person is the female slave. She speaks, nope, she's not right. Like, no one's going to believe her. The next person is a male slave. He has more clout than her because he's male, but he's still enslaved. So he's still not believed. Then finally, the third speaker is a free person. So the third speaker is a free male, and he, after an hour, he insists, and the Greek says, in truth, this one was also with him. So first he echoes the words of our female slave, that she said, he's with him, and the third speaker says that too, but he adds, in truth. And Peter again says, I do not know what you're saying, but of course the reader knows, right? The reader is convinced Peter is a disciple of Jesus. And so Luke creates this incremental structure of accusations in this bit. And he makes it clear that the slave girl was telling the truth because the third speaker, a free male, his voice would have been believed as truth. All right, so conclusions here. The slave girl speaks words of truth. She's a truth teller in the narrative. Peter's words, on the other hand, deny the truth over and over again, but she knows that who Peter really is. Her gaze lets her see Peter prophetically and know that he is indeed a follower of Jesus. She's an outsider. This is this Bakhtinian idea that she's situated on the outside of everything. The Jesus movement, free people, right? She is an outsider, so she can see the truth of who Peter really is, a disciple, a follower of Jesus. And then finally, she's a theologian in Luke. She gets to speak this one line, which would normally be overlooked and normally be not heard or believed, but she turns out to be accurate. She turns out to be a truth teller. A disciple is one who is with Jesus. And so she is vocalizing Lucan theology through this one phrase. Okay, so I'm going to make a few contemporary connections, and then I'd love to hear if you all have any questions or comments, or if we can engage in that dialogic interaction that Bakhtin would be very impressed with, right? So a couple contemporary connections. First, the repercussions of slavery. So in the American South, in particular, Christians advocated for slavery, right? They used the Bible, they used Paul, they used Acts, they used Jesus, they used all of these texts in order to support their enslavement of other people and to support the institution of slavery. So these biblical texts have this long history of being used to support oppression, to support slavery. And that hasn't gone away. That is continued through racism in America, and this idea of these biblical texts supporting slavery it's not disappeared. And so one of the things that my text, I hope, does is engages in liberation theology and this idea that that God is on the side of the oppressed, that God would want for us to be advocating for marginalized voices, for marginalized persons. And so when we read texts in this light, that's what we can do to give voice, to give agency to these minor or marginalized characters, which typically has led to oppression, but now can lead to empowerment through this kind of interpretation. And then empowering of female voices. So again, this historically, the Bible and the New Testament has been used to subjugate women, to oppress women, to not allow women's voices to speak. But this type of interpretation can allow a woman within the gospel text to have this important moment and to speak truth within the narrative. Okay, I guess now I would like to, I'm finished, and I'd like to hear if any of you have any questions or comments or thoughts. Yes.
I have two questions.
Great.
First, when the third person
Yes.
challenges Peter that you are with him,
Yes.
he states that he knows he's with him because he's a Galilean.
Yes.
What about Peter says he's a Galilean? The second question is dealing with slavery in America. Slavery in the Greco-Roman Empire, you say, was 10 to 20%. What is the percentage in America at the time of slavery? Is it closer to 40 to 50%?
Oh, wow. These are both very good questions. For the second one, I'm going to have to say I don't know exactly, but I can find out. So if you come next week, I can do a little digging. I'm an ancient historian and biblical scholar, and so I read some about slavery in America, especially the way biblical texts were used, but I don't know the numbers offhand. So I want to know that, especially in comparison to the Greco-Roman world. So thank you. My hunch is that we would say it's higher in the South and also, than it would have been in other areas, but let me get back. The first question, the Galilean, so it seems like people in the city were always judging people in the country, right? And so someone living in Jerusalem might have had a slightly different dress, slightly different accent maybe, and we have so Peter being from Galilee, Cana is where we think he might have been from, then Peter would have had maybe some tells, right? A little bit of, I'm from the rural South actually, and I hide my accent well, but every once in a while I think it comes out. And I have a little giveaway where someone will hear me say y'all or something, and they're like, oh, she's maybe not from this, from the city. And so I think that that's something very similar for Peter, that he would have been dressed as a little bit differently than someone in Jerusalem or the city, and maybe even spoke differently. Thank you so much. Good question. I'm not used to being so far away. I want to run down and talk to you in person.
Wouldn't the enslaved woman be afraid to speak? I mean, was there
Absolutely.
violence associated with,
Yeah.
could she have been whipped or beaten.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, the fact that she did speak, or that, I mean, she should have been fearful, especially that she was the first one, but also, yeah, enslaved women or men really didn't speak out of turn. They were most often silent. So yes, I mean, maybe she was punished after. We don't know what happened to her after this, but Peter in that moment wasn't super powerful, but whoever she was working for would have been like, why are you talking? Why? Yes. So that only adds to her marginalization, I think. Yeah, good.
Along those same lines, the word gaze, and you talk about the Roman Greco era being different than our Southern slavery.
Yes.
Would you, in Roman Greco times, not be allowed to look someone in the eye if you were a slave?
Yes, I think so.
Because in the South, that definitely is a taboo, and it still carries over to today's generation of my black colleagues who won't speak until the white person speaks.
Yes.
Or look at you and it's like, stop it. You have just as much.
Yes, thank you for that connection. Yes, and what we know about, while slavery in America was race-based and, was the transatlantic slavery is very different than what we have in antiquity, the aspects of slavery that you're touching upon, those interactions, are very similar than what we can know about. Brutality, violence that was used, which the other person mentioned, too. I mean, that would have been just as heavily used in antiquity as it was in the American South. So there's a lot of aspects of slavery that have a lot in common. The race-based thing is what is the biggest difference. But yes, I think for her to stare at Peter, first of all, being that he's a free person, would have been unacceptable. Yes. This whole scene is surprising when we think about it in those ways. Thank you. Yes, good. Over here.
My family came from the South, and so I was kind of curious as to whether we listed slaves in our assessment schedules for tax purposes. So I contacted the county treasurer where they had their plantation. Sure enough, they did.
Yes.
And the good news is they gave them Christian names.
Oh, interesting. Yes, I am also from the South and dealing with those types of repercussions. So looking through archives and history, I think is really an important project. There was one, I believe. Oh.
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry. So I was, to answer the question for how much.
Thank you. Did you look it up?
I study in school.
Great.
So it's around, I believe it's 18%.
18%.
Since it was outside of America, they had to bring people in.
Yes.
And so it was far less than the amount of people otherwise, and it was about 70-30, I want to say, for how many were enslaved in the South versus the North.
70-30.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. And so that does match our Greco-Roman percentages, right? Pretty exactly. Good. Thank you.
And I was also wondering, do you suppose that enslavers could have gone to heaven in this time as God was seen as an enslaver?
Oh, that's a really good question. I will say that I personally don't send people to heaven or hell, right? I let that be something that God will do, right? Or someone else outside of me. But the idea that enslavers, I will say many enslavers were Christian. So let's just say that, right? Many people who were who owning slaves were Christian, and we know this from a lot of different sources, right? And even our martyrs, some of our martyrs were enslavers and enslaved. So many people would have been, implicated within slavery. Does that make sense? And so in that moment, they would have all assumed they were going to heaven. There was debate about whether enslaved persons could or not, because in the Greco-Roman world, they assumed enslaved persons weren't fully human. This is like a debate about, humanity. And so, but many enslaved persons definitely saw themselves as Christian, as participating. We have records of enslaved persons being deacons, pastors. They were present within the early Christian church, just in a very visible way, right? Even if they weren't freed. Good question. Thank you. Yes.
I also look at this passage through a lens of sexism.
Oh, yes.
The ancient mansplainer.
Very good.
Where the woman identified him, but it took two more men to really identify that he was who he was.
Absolutely.
Once again.
Yes. Yes, excellent point. Yes. And I think you're exactly right. And also, even the male slave was viewed as less than the free male. So this is even more sexism or patriarchy at work there. Yeah. Thank you.
I was going to ask another question about all of the immigrants, all of the people who are fleeing other places trying to come to, whether it's the United States or someplace in Europe, and they're having to become not enslaved, but work in situations where it's low income and they just barely get by.
Yes.
Is there any relationship to the slavery in Greco-Roman times?
Yes, absolutely. There was a whole category for workers who were technically paid, but were still very low paid, let's say daily workers, and that category of persons was a large one, and they were very poor. They had relied upon daily wages, which was barely enough for them to survive. The difference here is that they were still not owned by someone, right? So they could, if they wanted to, they could move, they could leave, they could quit their jobs, and they would not have any repercussions, where an enslaved person could not do that. If they fled, they would be, killed or caught or, marked, in all these certain ways. And if they tried to resist, they were often violently, tortured or treated and sometimes killed. And there's a lot of laws protecting enslavers in the first century that would say, another person outside of the family could not mistreat their slave, but the enslaver had a lot of rights to mistreat their enslaved persons. And so actually another project I'm working on is poverty, and thinking about how people who were daily workers, as you said, how they might have been understood. And I think they were very impoverished and had a very difficult life, but also they were still free, right? So they still had at least some autonomy even with their difficult life. So the differences in between are there's a lot of similarities actually, but that one difference about being, bought and sold by another human being, that one is a line that really I feel like makes a big difference. Does that make sense? Yeah, thank you. Good.
So I was wondering if we're talking about the slave girl as someone who was enslaved by another person.
Yes.
And would it also be that she was an absolute believer, as it is referenced, as you say, that Christians are slaves of God, that we, as children of God, are slaves to him?
Yes.
Would that perhaps be her being an absolute believer, as though she, like you said, is a truth teller, and that she is this person who does not question, you know, like, I don't know.
You're asking if she could also be a believer. Yes, I mean, she could have been, right? It's hard to know exactly because of that moment. She's in the high priest's house, which is a very Jewish context, but that doesn't mean she herself was Israelite, right? Or was Jewish, because she could have been brought in from captivity. She could have been, and there's a lot of ways she could have made it there. She could have been born in the household, as I talked about before. But were many people in the first century area followers of Jesus? Yes, right? So, and we think enslaved persons too. And so she could have been. It's hard to know exactly, but that is certainly an interpretation. Yeah, good.
We're going to say thank you.
Yes. Thank you.